The 70s brought us some seminal cars like the Countach, the Stratos, the Challenger, the 911 RS, but the ones we're going to be talking about now are somewhat more controversial. The first was knowingly released with dangerous faults. The second was a bestseller despite being one of the worst cars ever made. The third was the source of one of the most widely believed automotive myths. The fourth, so terrible that they ended up closing the factory in which it was made. The fifth had quality control that involved the use of a hammer, I kid you not. And the last one was such a failure that it ended up killing off the marque altogether. But at least in some of these cases, the reputation that these cars have is not fully deserved. Let's find out more, and at the end we will crown which one is the worst of all. As a product of the fuel efficiency days following the 1973 oil crisis, the Ford Pinto wasn't actually a bad car. The problem was that the fuel tank was located between the rear axle and the rear bumper, meaning that in a rear end smash it was one of the first points of contact, therefore making leaks and fires much more likely. Apparently Ford knew it was dangerous but carried on producing it anyway, and what made this all the more inflammatory, was that Ford issued an official memo to the NHTSA, the National Highways Transport Safety Authority in the US, where it was claimed it had made a cost-benefit analysis versus paying for the lawsuits, which would have been 58 million, or the cost of fixing the cars, which would have been 138 million. And it obviously decided paying the lawsuits would have been cheaper. You can imagine the public outrage. The problem is that this was not entirely true. So the first thing is that the location of the fuel tank was absolutely standard in cars of this class, subcompacts. All the other makes, all the other cars were the same. Secondly, safety pressure groups greatly exaggerated the scale of deaths resulting from Pinto accidents. And lastly, and most importantly of all, Ford never actually made the cost-benefit analysis in the way that it was claimed. The so-called Pinto memo was actually the Grush-Saundby report, commissioned by Ford as part of their industry-wide lobbying efforts to persuade the NHTSA to delay implementation of certain safety standards. It did not make a cost comparison between fixing the Pinto or paying lawsuits. Instead, it compared the cost of re-engineering all affected cars sold in the US versus the societal costs for injuries and deaths related to this type of accident. In the end, Ford did issue a recall, but by that time it was too late and the damage had been done. So in hindsight, it's a little bit unfair to single out Ford for the way the Pinto was built. But before we rush too quickly to their defense, don't forget that there was another much bigger crime that arose from this saga, and that is that they used the Pinto as the platform for the Mustang II, a truly awful car. As a compact, the Pinto was great, but as the basis for a muscle car, it was awful. As you can see with the Pinto, not all these cars are quite as bad as they are made out to be. But with the next one, I think its reputation is fully deserved. Of the 807,000 Marinas sold in the UK, just 745 survived to 2006, making it the most scrapped car of the last 30 years. There was a facelift version of the Marina called the Ital, which ran from 81 to 84, but essentially this is the car that killed off the Morris name. After that, its replacement, the Montego, used Austin badging. It was built to replace the much-loved Morris Marina, which had been going at that stage for 23 years. And the original designs were actually pretty promising. The problem is that they were so short of money and time that they developed the car in just 18 months, leading to some real compromises. First of all, it was originally designed for quite a tall engine, meaning that to balance out the tall front of the car, there was quite an ungainly, sort of humpy back end. The tall engine in the end wasn't used, but they were stuck with that rather ugly profile. The other thing is it was supposed to have independent McPherson suspension all round. But again, due to cost, that was scrapped, and they ended up using a modified version of the minor suspension, which dated back to 1948. To make things worse, the first press cars were also sent out with incorrectly assembled front suspension, giving the car laughable amounts of understeer. It was outdated and outclassed, but despite this, it was one of Britain's best-selling cars. It peaked in first place in 1973, but for the next few years, it stayed within the top 4 sellers. Altogether, an incredible 1.2 million of these things were produced. Shockingly, it formed the basis of what we know as the modern Hyundai. 2 cars were brought to South Korea in 1974. They were studied, and Hyundai's first global car, the Pony, was essentially based on the Marina design. It was the global success of this car that launched Hyundai into becoming one of the world's major manufacturers. Why aren't you talking about the Allegro, I can hear you ask? Well, the simple truth is that they were both awful cars. But the Allegro at least failed in a much more interesting way. It was a modern design. They really tried to do something different. Now, it would be difficult to beat the Marina, but the next car managed to start off probably the most widely believed myth related to cars in the world. Fiat initially had big plans for the Beta. So it was an advanced car. It had front-wheel drive. It had disc brakes all round, a 5-speed gearbox, independent suspension, and it was well received by the press. Autocar said it was luxuriously appointed and very spacious. Performance and economy are good, ride and road noise are better than average, and it was also solidly built and nicely finished. It failed in a way that was totally avoidable. It cemented the reputation of Italian cars as being affected by rust. It was not unknown for cars of only 2 years old to be recalled back by Lancia and to be scrapped for structural rust. The explanation that many believe is that the Italians were using inferior quality recycled Russian steel. This is completely untrue and was actually manufactured by the British press. The rationale was that having sold the production line for the 124 to Russia, Fiat was then paid in recycled Russian steel. That wasn't true. It was paid in oil, and the reason that these Lancias rusted was entirely different. The front chassis rails had a flaw in the design, which meant that they formed a natural pocket at the front. This would collect water, rust through, the subframe which was attached underneath would come off, and the engine would come with it. Lancia never recovered from this calamity. The UK was its biggest market outside of Italy. Within a few years, it was forced to withdraw and is now more or less dead. Our next car should and could have been a success. It even won a Car of the Year award. The P76 had lots going for it. It was designed by Michelotti, who had penned some of the world's most beautiful cars. It won Car of the Year from Wheels magazine in Australia, and it had a stiff structure, rack and pinion steering, and an all-aluminium V8 that made it about 250 kilos lighter than the competition. It was well received by journalists and the public alike. And yet the sales were so poor that Leyland ended up closing down the factory of Zetland in which it was made. So how did this happen? Well, the P76 was affected by the British Leyland malaise from back home in the UK. This meant there was no extra funds to send its subsidiary, and they had to make the new model out of their own funds. So they were tight on budget and on time. This meant that the car was rushed through and was released with quality problems, and particularly detrimental in Australia is that the first cars were prone to overheating. But what really killed it was the oil crisis in '73, and much more suspiciously, the inability or the seeming inability of component suppliers in Australia to give Leyland what it needed in order to build enough cars. Now, it has been whispered that it was the big three, so that's Holden, Chrysler and Ford in Australia, that had put pressure on these suppliers because they felt threatened by what was in fact a really good product. So although it has a really bad reputation, I don't think that that is fully deserved. That's not something we can say with the car that is coming up now. Like DeLorean, Malcolm Bricklin decided to make a car and use his own name on it. But This was so bad that it made the DeLorean look like an engineering magnum opus. To start off with a bit of fraud, Bricklin was funded by the regional government in Brunswick in Canada. But they had done this on the understanding that they were paying for Bricklin to build production facilities. In fact, he used that money for the development of the car and to pay off wages. It was supposed to be a sports car, but it was laughably heavy. 1,630 kilos for a car in this class was completely unworkable. It had doors that weighed 45 kilos each, so they opened gullwig fashion and had to be helped with an electric mechanism because they were so heavy. The engine, the Ford engine for the 1975 model, only produced 175 horsepower. Couple this with a Slushmatic 3-speed gearbox and you can see why this was no sports car. It was so badly designed and made that during production, the panels for the fiberglass body, about 25%, 1 in 4, had to be rejected. And at one point they introduced a testing regimen which meant using a 3-kilogram hammer to hit the panels. If they didn't laminate, then they went on the cars. It didn't handle, it was slow, and it was really badly built. Also, the financial planning was so bad that within 2 years, the retail price had doubled. What was Malcolm Bricklin thinking? His background might explain why he was never going to succeed in producing a premium sports car. Bricklin made his money by importing the Subaru 360. A car which was ugly, terrible handling and unsafe even by the standards of 1968. It was the cheapest car on sale at just £1,300 and there was a reason for that. Bricklin discovered that because it was so light, it was exempt from US safety standards. Hardly the kind of heritage that you're looking for when you go on to make a sports car. Bricklin wasn't finished though. He was clearly intent on punishing North America for the failure of the SV-1. So in later years, he was the one who went on to import another one of the world's worst cars. He took the Yugo into the US and Canada. Now Triumph was already in trouble by this stage, but to start with, this particular car was an awkward design. So it's said that Giugiaro, the famous Italian designer, saw one at one of the car shows, walked from one side, then round to the other, put his hands in his head and said, "Oh my God, they've also done it on the other side." And he's talking about that really strange upturned line that goes between the door and the rear boot. The body was designed by the same person who came up with the Austin Princess, so I guess we shouldn't really be too surprised that it was a bit ungainly. In actual fact, apart from that, it wasn't a bad car. The problem once again was the way it was made. In one of the first road tests in 1977, a German motor magazine, Automotive und Sport, reported that the engine of the TR7 boiled over on a maximum speed 2-mile run. Electrical issues and bits falling off seemed to be the norm on early cars. Constant strikes and poor labour relations at BL's Liverpool factory were the main source of these problems. Things did improve, but by then it was too late. It was also affected by the very strong pound, which made it expensive to buy in its biggest market, which was the US. It did so much damage that no real Triumphs were ever produced again. There was the Acclaim that ran for 4 years after this, but this was simply a Honda Ballard produced under licence in the UK. Now bizarrely, the story isn't totally finished because Triumph is one of the only bits of the BL empire that BMW still owns, and in 2023, Machina, a design house in London, made a prototype called the TR25. It's based on the BMW i3S, but it's a little open-top sports car, which I think looks fantastic and has incredible potential. I don't think anything came of it, but just the idea of Triumph being revived, I think it's something to hope for. So which do you think is the worst car of the 70s? I think the Leyland and the Pinto were mainly victims of circumstance. The Beta was actually a good car, it was just one terribly big flaw that did it in. But that leaves the Marina, the Triumph and the Bricklin. The Marina at least had one thing going for it. It might not have been very good, it might have had quite old mechanicals, but it was cheap and it did sell well. The Triumph, okay, it didn't look brilliant, but it was actually quite successful in motorsport, and I think it had the potential to be a good car. The Bricklin, on the other hand, I simply cannot find any redeeming features for. Now, I haven't included some rather obvious cars to this, like the Lada Riva, because I wanted to include some cars that weren't quite so obvious, but also the Vaz was actually very good for its intended market. It wasn't a brilliant car for the evolved West, but for the rough and tumble in Russia, it worked pretty well. Let me know which you think the worst car of the 70s is, and if you're interested, here is a video detailing that whole myth about the Russian steel and the real reasons that Italian cars were so subject to this malaise, which included the mafia and all sorts of other stuff. Thank you so much for watching. Look forward to seeing you for the next video.